Welcome, welcome. My name is Sujan Pak, and I'm Dean of the School of Theology at Boston University, and I think we're going to have a wonderful time tonight. It's my honor to welcome you to the Spring Lowell Lecture. And so we're so glad that all of you are here in this room, and we're glad for those who are joining us virtually online. I want to begin by recognizing the generous support of the Lowell Institute. The Lowell Lectures have become a wonderful tradition at the School of Theology that makes possible the visionary leadership and generosity, made possible by the visionary leadership and generosity of the Lowell Institute. I offer my profound gratitude on behalf of the school to the Lowell Institute for partnering with the School of Theology for many years now to provide this kind of space for learning, awareness, and conversation. I also want to express my hearty thanks to Andrew Kimball for his leadership. Andrew has been instrumental in facilitating the planning of this event and all the various details. He's an amazing person. Your grace and goodness is amazing, and you bring that to everything you do. Thank you, Andrew. The Lowell Lectures this year are focused on reimagining theological education for today. And last fall, if you were able to join us, we had Dr. Ted Smith from Candler School of Theology join us and present on theological education in the age of individualization. And tonight, we are honored to welcome Dr. Keri Day in our event tonight entitled Testifying, Notes on the Futures, plural, of Theological Education. And our own Dr. Jimmy McCarty will interview Dr. Keri Day to gain her wisdom on this topic. So let me now introduce our distinguished guests. Dr. Jimmy McCarty is Clinical Assistant Professor and Director of the Tom Porter Religion and Conflict Transformation Program at Boston University School of Theology. He has published multiple articles in journals of theology, ethics, and law, and is an editor of the forthcoming book, The Business of Incarceration, Theological and Ethical Reflections on the Prison Industrial Complex. Prior to coming to BU, he held positions at the University of Washington, Seattle University, and Oxford College of Emory University. Dr. McCarty has degrees from Pepperdine University and Claremont School of Theology, and earned his doctorate in religion and social ethics from Emory University. So we welcome you, Dr. McCarty. And our distinguished guest, Dr. Keri Day, is Professor of Constructive Theology and African American Religion at Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey. She earned a BS in Political Science and Economics from Tennessee State University, an MA in Religion and Ethics from Yale University Divinity School, and her PhD in Religion from Vanderbilt University. Her teaching and research interests are in womanist feminist theologies, social critical theory, cultural studies, economics, and Afro-Pentecostalism. She has authored 4 academic books, one being Unfinished Business, Black Women, the Black Church, and the Struggle to Thrive in America. Another, Religious Resistance and Neoliberalism, Womanist and Black Feminist Perspectives. And also, one that we will talk about a lot tonight, Notes of a Native Daughter, Testifying in Theological Education. And her most recent book, Azusa Reimagined, a radical vision of religious and democratic belonging. She's also been recognized by the NBC News as one of 6 Black women at the center of gravity in theological education in America. Alongside her scholarship, Dr. Keri Day has engaged public policy leaders. She has participated in White House briefings in Washington, D.C. to discuss issues related to economic policy, religious freedom, faith-based initiatives, human rights efforts, and peace-building efforts around the world. She has been a guest political commentator on KERA, NPR, DFW Fox News, and HuffPost Live on issues related to faith and politics. Dr. Keri Day has written for the New York Daily News, the Christian Century, the Feminist Wire, and the Huffington Post. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Keri Day. You both can come on up.
Thank you, Dean Pak. Thank you, Dr. Day, for being here with us this evening. It's truly an honor to have you here. As we get started this evening, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the series that your book, Notes of a Native Daughter, appears in, called Theological Education Between the Times. Can you tell us a little bit about the series, your particular participation in it, and how that participation shaped your own contribution to the series in this book?
Yeah, sure. So the TEBT series actually was started by Ted Smith, who came last semester, I believe. Yep. He reached out. Well, actually, he's been a part of really guiding a project over the last maybe 4 or 5 years on transformations in theological education. And he's invited, about 3 or 4 dozen scholars to participate at each level in terms of what they were doing. And he made a decision as a part of the grant to invite 12 scholars to write about the present and futures, I like to say, the multiple futures, and we can say something about that later, of theological education. And just as a side note, each sort of a scholar represented some different or unique context. So, for myself at the time, I was recruited while I was at Bright Divinity School, TCU. So at a divinity-based, university-based, a divinity school at that time, you had some coming from evangelical seminaries, one from a Catholic-based institution, another from a Korean evangelical. And so in some ways, it was to produce sort of multiple and diverse perspectives at a moment where it could be said that theological education is sort of experiencing its own sort of Copernican revolution, right? This decisive moment in terms of where we are and the various futures that potentially lie ahead. So with that being said, at first I thought, well, what can I write that has not already been written? Because people of color, actually for decades, we've been writing about theological education. We've been reflecting in particular about this topic. And it occurred to me a couple of things. The first one is, although we're seeing a major sort of decline over, really past a decade, this past decade of people coming in to divinity schools and seminaries, that's ATS, divinity schools and seminaries from mainline congregations. There has been an interesting sort of inversion, and that is there's been an influx of people of color, many of them from charismatic and neo-Pentecostal backgrounds, coming not only into ATS approved divinity schools, but also to like biblical institutes, non-approved, that are part of churches or what have you. And so for me, it's like, what is this moment, right? Especially as someone who's working on a book, Azusa Reimagined, trying to think about, sort of global religiosity in some of my articles as it relates to Christianity, of which, again, we could talk about the Pentecostalization of Christianity around the world, and what does that mean for the future of theological education, which then led to me wanting to write this book. And Notes of a Native Daughter is not only reflecting on, as a Black woman, my experience moving through the academy, but more specifically as a Pentecostal Black woman, right? And what that means, like when Pentecostalism has been marginal, that the Theological Academy can contribute something in that direction to Pentecostalism, but not vice versa. That, can't, because of its presumed primitive or, traits or what have you. So, I mean, that's how I got started, and that's what sort of brought me to this work.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you for the background, the group that you were working with. In light of that, a Black Pentecostal scholar, a Black Pentecostal woman who's working as a scholar, you described the book as testimony rather than traditional philosophical argument, right? So I wonder if you can say a little bit more what you mean by that and what it means to give a testimony of oneself as a native daughter and how that shaped your own career trajectory in teaching and research.
Yeah. I mean, right, so as academics, we part of what we trade in is the arguments, right? We trade in arguments. And there's something, I mean, that'd be a performative contradiction if I didn't say there's something I like about that. That's really important, that kind of Socratic method, when it's done well and not like with a one-upsmanship, so to speak. But for me, part of my move in the direction of testimony as a mode of knowledge, it's a practice that I'm describing, right, in some regards. So it's a collective practice in Pentecostal churches. Actually, testimony service really is phased out now. But I mean, when I was coming up, I won't give when, but when I was coming up. And what I loved about it is its collective nature, that one's experience of God and knowledge of God is something that is experienced collectively, so that has something to say about the production of knowledge, right? But then also what I liked about it is this sense of who the self is and what the self is to become is bound up with the community. I mean, and that's like really trite, but like you think about our neoliberal culture today, where we are trained, we're socialized, we're shaped to do the reverse, right? And that is to sort of self-actualize away and apart from community through like norms of competition or commoditization or what have you. And so, you know, for me, it was about testimony as an epistemology, I guess is what I'm getting at. A practice, but a different way of knowing that is rooted in community, that is rooted in the body, right? The divine presence is mediated through the body. So the body tells us something as well about what it means, how we experience God, what it means, right? To talk, to speak about God, and how that then shapes or impinges on what we are to do in the world. And so testifying is really about critiquing the forms of knowledge within the academy. We'll get more into this, but critiquing the forms of knowledge that don't allow for this sort of capacious and expansive way of thinking about the production of knowledge and what knowledge is in service to, right? If it, like in testimony service, if knowledge is in service to these larger questions of love, of care, like even of reconciliation. I remember there's a humorous note, and then I'll stop. You know, you often saw in testimony service, you know, someone is testifying about something that happened in the community. She offended me, like literally, people would get up and start doing this. And I was offended by this. But I just want to say right here, now I love you, sister such and such. And you sort of see, even in that moment, right, this sort of collective moment where people are rejoicing and the two people are coming together. And it seems like a really, again, a really trivial moment in some sense. Oh, well, okay. But what does that mean more broadly for how we even think about like our ethics, right? How do we situate that within the context, again, of an academic structure, or maybe I should say the work and reward structure that that privileges or grants rewards to those who you know, do what they do in a vacuum, you know, that participate in these principles of, and not to say, you know, I think there's a complicity that, if you're in the academy, in some ways, there's a complicity that we all bear. So I'm not, in me saying this, I'm not trying to locate myself outside of that. But I think self-awareness is key in how we think about how we unravel and extricate ourselves from what our context has become. So.
Can you say more about how testifying and testimony might be an epistemological mode and how that really would maybe change the way we think about the work of theology or ethics or formation for ministry? Like how does that show up for you? Yeah,
well, I mean, like, and if you don't mind to refer to some points in the book that sort of map onto this question. I mean, just one example, and I know we're going to talk about this, but I'll go ahead. The
Do
learning.
it now. Go
Good.
ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
The learning to pass, right?
Yeah. That's the next question. So let's do it.
The learning to pass chapter 2, in which, you know, the metaphor idea of passing, you know, it's written about quite a bit in the beginning of the 20th century in Harlem Renaissance literature. But I mean, it has a genealogy that goes before that. But this idea, right, that, you know, those that were African American, you know, if they had a certain phenotype, mainly leaning towards white, they would pass, but all the ambivalences, right, that were associated with this practice of passing, that implicated not only the individual passing, but the broader structures that created this dilemma for the individual. And so for me, I thought this was an apt metaphor, that you have many, and just not people of color, okay? This could go across class as well. But for me, writing as a black woman, coming in and watching, in particular, black women, black folks, people of color, come in, and that part of what it means to legitimate oneself, part of what it means to render oneself legible within the dominant paradigms, whether that's the knowledge production process, scholarship, teaching, whatever. To render oneself legible, it means sort of leaving behind the sort of the indigenous grammars and vocabularies that have come to define you up until that point, right? That you can't take those with you, because in some ways those vocabularies and grammars are seen as anti-intellectual or just not intellectual at all. And so part of this learning to pass is really problematic, and many folks of color coming in, they feel that tension in their body. And so to your question of, well, how does this relate to testimony? I mean, part of why I wrote that chapter on learning to pass, and I lift up Katie Cannon and James Cone and others, of people I feel that really attempt to negotiate the terrain upon which, academic terrain upon which one is constantly having to stare in front of them, the problem of passing, is to really then write in the mode of testimony concerning epistemology, to say, what would it mean if we took seriously, right, these grammars and these vocabularies? What might they yield, right? And so in the first chapter then, in Hanging New Ornaments, one of the things I talk about, for example, in my church, is not only through dance, but through music, so not only like aesthetic, but sonic experiences that in some ways offer not only different visions, but different experiences of what we come to know about the world, right? What does it mean then we have these various types of knowledge? But that only comes through hearing, right? The modes of knowledge that people are coming with, their vocabularies, their grammars, that are not anti-intellectual, that can profoundly correct this idea, you know, in the West, of the way in which knowledge, you know, the way in which we privilege knowledge that is abstract, the way in which we privilege knowledge often that sort of floats free from bodies and identities. And so testimony really is honestly about reclaiming a kind of social locatedness in how we, in our speech, in our forms of reasoning, in our forms of moral deliberation about the world.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you so much. You referred to this image that you use of hanging new ornaments. I thought it was a beautiful image. And you talked a little bit, it seemed to me just now, about bringing some ornaments that you have from your Pentecostal house into the academy, right, or into theological education. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how being someone who has been involved in theological education for a while now as a student and as a professor at multiple levels, multiple institutions, what are some of the gifts you've maybe received from that experience that allowed you to hang some new ornaments in your Pentecostal house as well, right? So you're bringing some here, and you're taking some from here to there, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about that movement as well. How is being someone who has been so central to the work of theological ed in the 21st century helped you think about what it means to be a Pentecostal person in the world as well? Right?
No, that's a really great question. You know, one of the things that I hope was communicated in the text is this kind of, this sense in which, whatever phenomenon we're talking about, right? So whether we're talking about the academy, whether we're talking about churches, that we're always talking about like multiplicity. We're always talking about the diversity of churches, right? Diversity of communities and the diversity of scholarship represented in the academy proper. And so, I mean, for me, part of what I tried to write about is this idea that I grew up in the Church of God in Christ, the largest Pentecostal denomination, I believe, right now in the United States, black or white. And part of what I realized as I was matriculating through my master's and then my PhD program is that there were other, what I call progressive Pentecostalisms in the text. There were other kinds of Pentecostalisms that were certainly grounded in the traditions that they came out of, but were doing something more. And I should say, even though I didn't write about it this way, they were modeling for me what it means to hang new ornaments, right? So I'm thinking of Yvette Flunder, right, of the Fellowship for Affirming Ministry. That's had the biggest impact on me that I write about in the text. Where in some ways, she writes about having an edge theology, what it means to listen and allow our theological sensibilities to be tutored by those on the margins. But what I love about Bishop Flunder's work is that it's not just about taking what we learn back to the center, right? But so as if the work is about integration into a center that might be problematic, right, at the core. But rather, it's about what it means to go out to the margins, in her words, that there's such a party going on. And that's how she said, there's such a party going on the margins, that people begin migrating out to the margins, right? And this ties into the theme about the multiple futures.
Yeah.
That when that happens, then there isn't a center as such, right? But rather there are on the margins different sites where people are able to make meaning, where they're able to make sense of the world and their identity and their vocational lives, and that all of them simultaneously happening all represent some aspect of truth in the world. And you know, truth as a kind of not just like propositions that we assent to intellectually, but as a kind of lived experience, right? About what enables the flourishing of, you know, ourselves and others. And so for me, part of the hanging of new ornaments, getting back to the question, part of the hanging of the new ornaments for me has been attuning my ear, like attuning my heart, right? That to the openness to the possibility. I mean, if I'd have just like stayed in my tradition proper and just, no, you need to ordain women, you need to do this, you need to do that, you know, and things like that. But it was wonderful, as I write about, to, you know, Tennessee State University, where I got my beginning in the HBCU. And, you know, then to go to Yale, where I'm picking up lessons along the way, to then have an ethics of openness, right? Because there was a certain transformation I had to go through, right? Before I could think in, you know, in my estimation, creative ways about what this means for others in the classroom, and my students and so forth. And so for me, it's just been a profound joy to think about in terms of how do we think about multiple futures in theological education. A part of that is hanging new ornaments, but it does mean thinking in, a more expansive way about the sources of our knowledge with respect to how, you know, then we come back to our tradition and then try to speak to our tradition.
Oh, that's excellent. So one of the ways you talk about this openness that you've grown to experience is learning to desire more and more people, right? Desiring others, desiring to be in certain kinds of relationship, desiring to be in the presence of, desiring to be learning from. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about what you envision with that and how learning that we might desire one another is part of the educational experience, right?
Yeah.
So, and that how that might invite the opportunity to hang some new ornaments ourselves.
Oh, that's great. Right. Yeah. You know, one of the things that I've learned better over the last maybe 5 or 6 years is that, and it seems like it should be intuitive, but and that is that being an academic and being a scholar in theological education, you know, it is about the field we teach, right? It is about the love for the field, the love for the scholarship, the love for teaching. But also what we're up to is a sense of formation, right? Of spiritual formation, right? And of moral formation. And so with that being said, I think that part of the issue that has been present, I think, in the university, just in higher education, and I think this has trickled and it has affected theological education, is the way in which, because, you know, theological institutions like universities are becoming, as you know, more corporatized, right? Again, I just said earlier, the principles of competition and commoditization, it malforms people. And so the point here is that when people are coming to be formed in a particular kind of way, often what happens within these theological educational contexts is because that formational aspect is not thought through well, right, with care. And maybe some professors don't even see it as an end per se of what they do, that it leads to a kind of malformation, right? And so for me, you know, part of what I've been trying to think about with respect to my scholarship as well as teaching and my mentoring is, and this goes back to, again, you know, what it means to hang new ornaments within the academy, you know, is how to think about this process, this very, and it's tricky, right? Yeah. I mean, between the, you know, conversations of spiritual and moral and educational formation with what we do, because people are coming from a diversity of backgrounds. Yeah. That's just the truth, with all kinds of different commitments and norms by which they live by. And so for me, it has really been about thinking about the process of formation and why that is so central. But I will say this, because you're really alluding to the final chapter when I'm talking about desire and becoming undone. Okay, so let me just say this is a very controversial chapter. Okay.
Oh, it's my favorite chapter.
Okay, it was controversial. It was a very controversial chapter. I love academics, and I want to be fair. I want to be fair to the concerns here, and I think this matters to this entire conversational formation. On the one hand, it's almost like people either loved it or hated it. This fourth chapter, so this is like boom. On the one hand, for those that loved it, it was, oh, you know, this is a kind of call to reconciliation. And almost in the way that some people were appropriating it, it was rather uncritical of the fact that I spent the first three chapters talking about the structural transformation, the structural framework out of which anything like individual desire is even, you know, viable, right? So you had those that did that. Others that were like, oh, this is very liberal. I hate it because there really are no conditions under which an institution can do this, right? A kind of, as I was talking to a group earlier, a kind of, this is like Niebuhrian, right, Reinhold, a kind of political and theological realism. And so first, let me say this, I probably would rewrite the chapter differently today. But one of the things that I think has been very helpful about this conversation concerning formation is two things. The first thing is that I don't think we really can underestimate, going back to the corporatization and sort of the neoliberal character of the university and of education generally in America, even if you're freestanding, we can't underestimate how this shapes and affects institutions, so that even the practice of becoming undone, and I think this is very important. This is like part of the call to the Gospels, right? To me, this is part of the scandal, you know. But I think we can't underestimate a real kind of carefulness around this, because what does it mean to call, you know, say certain communities that have been disenfranchised to become undone in structures that benefit off of the exploitation of their labor and time. What does that concretely mean? And how, like for myself as a scholar, how do I take responsibility for that? So in terms of formation, having a kind of, and that's what I, you know, wish I had a bit more of when I was writing that chapter, that you could feel a kind of realism that pervaded, and although I say this is in the form of a prayer, I'm not being didactic, I'm not saying we should, but even as a form of a prayer, as an ideal, there still is a kind of carefulness of the state that we're in, right? And that, as I was saying to a group, that, you know, as one scholar told me, institutions don't bleed, right? Which is really, institutions don't bleed. Institutions are set up to perpetuate themselves, right? But we do. And so with that being said, how do we think about formation? How do we think about these sort of practices, undoing of desiring, which is needed, but within the context, within a structural context where violence, honestly, both symbolic and real, is ever present. So as you can see, it's not that I'm searching, that I'm trying to offer answers at this point, but rather I am really interested in asking, what are the kinds of questions, right, that we need to have in mind that enable us to be sensitive to this reality as we seek a kind of impossible possibility, right? Which is about this desire across, you know, profound lines of difference and, you know, difference and alterity, because I think that's literally what the Gospels call us.
Oh, wow. That's good. You're already getting to some of the other questions a little bit too. But one of the things that I think can happen as well in that undone conversation, right, is oftentimes when we're listening and hearing our students, they're going through what is often called in public discourse experiences of deconstruction, right? So deconstructing problematic theologies, separating themselves from communities that have been harmful to them, and introducing new ones, which can be really disorienting for folks. But I think I hear in your call to being undone something that's not quite the same as that.
That's good.
And I wonder if you can tease out a little bit what that is, because I think that also gets at what makes it so difficult within some of these dominant institutions to do the work of undoing, because we can conceive of deconstruction sometimes as, if not purely, at least primarily, this intellectual kind of work. But I hear something a little more beyond that in your call to being undone. So I wonder if you want to speak to that at all in any way.
Thank you for pulling. Exactly. Yes, for me, how do I say this? And this is in part my own theological sensibility, actually, about knowledge of God and knowledge of the world. So I'm going to give you a little preview of my inauguration lecture in 3 weeks. Try it out here. And right, exactly. That in some ways, it's sort of like in Corinthians, right? We see through a glass darkly, right, or dimly in some translations. That there is a kind of, whenever we're talking about what we know, we only know in part. There's a partial, fragmented way of knowing, and if we take seriously that kind of partial, fragmented way of knowing, it means that there is always something in our relationships with others and in the repair. And when I say repair, I'm literally thinking of like reparations too, but repair of those relationships, the structural and the existential dimension. Repair, it means that we in some regards, we have to embrace that there is something we don't know. Right, that when we're coming to an encounter that is being willed by both parties, that there's something that we might experience, this expectation. There's something we might experience that we do not yet know. And I'd say, for academics, that's you heard
the room get real quiet.
That's a lot. Because we know, we don't want people to know the gaps in our knowledge. That's the worst thing you can do. Ask a question I don't know. So, they teach you a part of your armor as academic is that you know. And so, but what does it mean to think kind of like as an ethics, right? A kind of apophatic practice of not knowing, which facilitates an unknowing that opens you up, that makes you vulnerable to a new kind of experience. And so I wish I could write this chapter again. So I mean, part of the undoing, I mean, this is what I am trying to get at, is that it is a deconstruction in the sense of, and I say this in the chapter, that it's not, part of the deconstructive moment is there is a cost, structurally, literally, that people must come to the table with. It's not just the kumbaya moment, right? So that, and this is Jennifer Harvey, who I think has done a lot of great work around whiteness studies, that then the work for, say, for example, for white folks is very different than the work for, Asian Americans or Latinas or African Americans. And so, yes, I mean, with that being said, then we're coming to the table. But part of it is this the possibility, I should say, of the encounter hinges on a kind of unknowing, like not knowing, a partial knowing that facilitates an unknowing. And it's only through that, right, that we are truly open to what this encounter, and I think, to me, this is why I love biblical scholars so much, is, I mean, you look at the stories in the gospel, and they're so unpredictable. Like, especially if you read the stories through fresh eyes, and because a part of that is a kind of the way in which, say, the parables facilitate, in my estimation, a kind of divestment of what you think you know about what, and to me, that's that kind of way of being and speaking. That's like in an apophatic register is what I'm after in undoing.
Yeah. Oh, that's dangerous. We've all been in the meetings where the not knowing what will be on the other side of the new thing that we might be trying to do is a reason not to do the new thing.
That's true.
We've all seen that in practice. So that's you're calling, that feels dangerous to us. As
and I want to implicate myself again, right? I mean, we have our own, territories and in terms of what we're doing. And part of how we lean on our expertise is because we know. I mean, right. So in some ways, this is a spiritual practice. It's a profoundly, I feel like, theological moment that, and let me just say this, it doesn't really answer this prior question that I was just asking about, well, is the encounter that I'm talking about related to theological education, is that something that can really be done within institutions? I like to hold out the possibility that it can, but I want to leave that question suspended, like in midair, like I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, but what I do know is that we are lost.
Yeah. Yeah.
like quite literally, you know, without conversation around desire, which helps to form us in the ways that I think we should be formed.
Yeah. Oh, that's excellent. Part of that chapter on becoming undone, you also call for new ways of being in community, right? So it's not just this undoing process, but this also becoming process. That's a part of that, especially becoming a new way of being community. And you have some really concrete kinds of practices you invite us into there: witnessing, vulnerability, and risk. You name that this is not necessarily fully safe or predictable, but that you call us to witness one another, be vulnerable to one another, and to risk with and for one another. I wonder if you could say more about what you think that looks like, or could look like, or maybe has looked like in moments in your own journey through theological education, and what that might mean, so we could think together as a School of Theology here about what that might look like in this place, with these people at this time.
So what I want to do is, like in answering this question, is talk about how I've moved through as like a tenured, full professor with a certain kind of privilege at the institutional level. So one example I gave was the group that I met with about risk and how that, how that opens up to vulnerability, but nevertheless the ambiguities, right? The complexities. I don't ever want to come across as like, it's a 1, 2, 3, it's a formula, like, ingredients mix, no. That there's still deep ambiguities and even like contradictions, how we experience institutionally within an institution, questions of vulnerability. But in terms of risk, here's an example. We had the slavery audit. I wrote about that in the book at PTS. And then we rolled out a series of reparations. Well, anyone that understands the way institutions work, the politics of institutions, you know that a part of any reparative program at the institutional level, comes through a lot of conversation, right, with a number of different people that have different political interests involved, okay? And so with that being said, I remember, they announced what we would be doing in terms of how many scholarships now would be earmarked for Black students. The one professorship that we were going to have, that we began looking for this person in 2 or 3 years. And I think like there was a major, I can't remember, maybe the Washington Post, someone wrote about this. It was really big because like the Black seminarians went to the media about it. And I remember that when I met with the Black seminarians, there was this feeling not only of anger but of disappointment, and because I'm actively a part of this group that was doing that was of trying to think about what needed to be done. There was a lot of disappointment and hurt aimed toward me, and so I remember sitting there, and your first sort of knee-jerk reaction is like, no, they don't know all that went on behind these closed doors. The immediate knee-jerk reaction is to offer defense or an apologetic, right? And I remember sitting there, and I remember saying to myself, instead of doing that, because that feels too easy and it's actually unhelpful. Instead of doing that, because in some ways I am a Black woman, I'm situated in a complex way. There are many ways in which I experience structural racism and disenfranchisement. There are also ways that I occupy spaces of privilege with respect, for example, to the Black seminarians, to a group like this. And so they took a risk, right? Because some of them were in my class as well. They took a risk out of the commitment and their own, pathos and really trust, right? To let me know how they felt. Some with tears rolling down their eyes. And for me to listen, hear their risk, right? In which I occupy structurally a position of privilege as a senior person there. And to really take seriously, what they were saying, and to listen. And then, this is part, of sort of risk, vulnerability, the cost associated. I talk a lot throughout the book about the cost, that what is our work? Part of that is like a material, structural cost, right? I'm like, oh man, oh no, I'm sorry, at that time I wasn't full professor, I'm going full professor, okay, I wanted to, all right, well, how do I navigate these really interesting, but I began to realize I'm ticking off again, like what the academy makes us become, right? And that neoliberal, well, it's not just that, but it's also these sorts of things. And as goods that I would like to have. And it was sort of in that moment that I said, there's certain battles that are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost, right? And we began that process of me and another colleague who was just very wonderful, of going back into conversation with the task force, with the moderators, and trying to beef up, trying to get more, as it should have been from the beginning, but get more than initially, what was there. And so, including renaming the chapel. How in the world can people come in and worship in a chapel that has the name of a slaveholder? That's the primary place, right? We come together. And so, I mean, this is just like one example, right, of what it means. And I think, like, institutionally, this is really important, right? For, I mean, I was talking about with the group the browning, the blackening of higher education, extends to theological education, but that doesn't really map with senior level positions and administration, where all of your major decisions are being made. And so, I mean, again, this feeds back into, how are institutions and those, in positions in these institutions, how are they really grappling, right, with this question of themselves, with vulnerability and risk and so forth. But again, what still hangs over our heads, I want us to get away from that, is, what are the conditions for the possibility of this occurring in institutional life, right? So.
You've pointed to this, right? The ambiguities, the maybe impossibility of some of the things you might hope for or you're called for in the text happening within our current dominant institutions, right? So I'm going to read this question that I pre-wrote that is going to hint to that, but it's going to, I want to name it this way, partly to invite some more reflection on maybe what needs to happen beyond these institutions, right? So here's the question. You say that, quote, new educational futures are possible only when we move beyond the content of theological education to address the form and the structure of theological education, end quote. Only possible if we address the form and structure. And this is what I wrote. I sent this along to you. I must confess, I don't think many of us are ready to think like this. It seems to me that this might require, I don't know, it's an unknowing, but it might require a de-linking of theological education to American university forms and structures. But I'm not sure if you're thinking of something this radical or not. So would you say more about what forms and structures of theological education you have in mind as needing to be addressed, and what might addressing those look like, or what might that result in? What are these forms and structures, and what are the actual possibilities under the current dominant systems we have, and what might that mean for the futures of theological ed? And even in that title, I think you might hint at some of that, but I'd love to hear you talk about it a little bit more.
So I'm going to stay really concrete with this question instead of philosophizing the way academics like to do. So about the question, the form, and so I want to talk a bit about, like, Princeton, what we're doing there, and I mean, even in terms of what we're doing, some of the this is being recorded, right? Okay, some of I'm being funny. I'm kidding. Some of the tensions that are present, even in the midst, right, of what we're doing. So, for example, part of our strategic plan, just written, I think it was beginning about 4 or 5 years ago, it was pre-pandemic, about, in some ways, because of, like, declining, I mean, Princeton, we're also feeling the squeeze of this, declining enrollments in terms of residential students as face-to-face students. And thinking about, when I say new forms or structures, not just like new methods of delivery, like the vehicles, and I'll get to that in a moment, on like virtual and online, but also what we take to be where theological education happens and how it happens, right? And so, for example, part of the strategic plan that we articulated 5 years ago was that what would it mean to rethink Princeton Theological Seminary, not simply as a place like where students come, where they're sort of traditionally educated within the various disciplines, and they go out and do whether it's parish work or non-parish work. But what would it mean to think about Princeton Theological Seminary as an international hub, where they are interacting with all kinds of different, not just like religious communities, but social, political, economic groups. And that can be in on our campus where they're coming for short stints of doing whatever, or whether that is virtual, or whether that's we're taking our presence over, however we can figure it, right? But that in some ways we're reimagined as a kind of reservoir, right, for a new way of thinking, not just about church life, but about the world and its operations, right? About the world and its activities. What would it mean to and I mean, of course, Princeton has historically has one of the most traditional seminary. We still have the four anyway, Schleimarchian four. So at any rate, what does it mean to rethink that? And so that's led to a few things. One, so just thinking concretely what we've done. The MTE in theology and ecology, we have the Farminary. A lot of people are familiar with the Farminary. That's been really big. You have some students that, that email or contact the admissions office saying, no, I just want to apply to the Farminary. Like, how can I apply to the Farminary? Not the seminary, the Farminary.
Interesting.
And, because, this is really, really important in a multiplicity of ways. Like, it's not just that white rural, folks are talking about the intersection between faith and ecology, for example, but also you have urban color activists of color that are talking about what it means to be ecologically aware in terms of practices within urban areas. I mean, this is just going on, and so we have this program, 18-month program, where folks come. It's a hybrid program. Well, they're in residence, but then the last part is a bit hybrid. Where most of what they do is facilitated on the farm, but with respect to a number of different leaders that they're also in conversation with within the region, within the area, with respect to these issues. And so, I mean, this is one, what does it mean to think about the form? The form and the structure has everything to do with who do we imagine the student to be? Right? And that shifted and changed. And so that's one example. Another program that actually Dr. Eric Barreto, a good friend and a colleague, we've led out in is, I was talking to the dean about this, is the Master of Arts in Theology, MAT, in Justice and Public Life, which it's a hybrid program, online and in person, and it brings together mid-career professionals in law, in medicine, in the arts, in business. I mean, in this cohort, we had a federal judge, we had lawyers, we had healthcare people. But the point is here that in some ways it's functioning as an international hub of sorts, right? Where they're coming in. And here's the catch in terms of the form and the structure. It's not just that they're being transformed with what we have to offer. We are being transformed with what they are giving us, right? And not just as an individual professor, but at the institutional level. After this cohort, we were like, what are the implications for this institutionally and some of the things that we were learning through the people we were teaching. And so, this form and structure question, it is about sort of the where, and then also like how are theological institutions, how are they partnering with other organizations to facilitate the work of theological reflection to those who would never walk in, or for many different reasons, to a seminary or divinity school or school of theology. And so, and then most importantly, that content-informed question has to do with like the aims and ends, right? I think we can no longer presume we simply know the ends of theological education. I think, you could tell me like I'm an apophatic theologian, right? Everything is a shroud of mystery, right? But you can never, but it's just true. We can never, I mean, you think about just the drastic changes that we've undergone since the pandemic, right? I'm serious, since the pandemic. That part of it is this sort of epistemic humility that there are some ends we can anticipate and others that sort of, we come to understand as we continue to facilitate the things that we're facilitating in conversation with
Yeah.
communities around the nation and
Yeah.
around the world.
Yeah.
And so to me, in this way, concretely, this is what I'm referring to
Yeah.
in terms of the form and structure that, again, totally revolutionizes and reframes
Yeah.
how we do residential education. It's
Yeah.
totally like, after this online piece, one of the things I said to myself, oh wow, there's a lot of pedagogical things I'm doing in my syllabus that's completely underdeveloped. It took the online piece to help me realize that. And so I'll stop there, but I mean, these
Yeah.
are some of the things that I have in mind.
Yeah. Oh, this is great. So I'm going to take a moment here, let you get some water, catch your breath. I want to invite folks who have questions. If you have questions, we have a microphone over on this side of the room. So I want to invite folks to go ahead and get up, go around this way, come stand at the microphone in a line. If you have a question that you want to ask Dr. Day, so you can bring it up that way. And then we'll move into your questions after a couple more comments here. So I just want to give you the word. If you're in the audience, you'd like to ask a question, move over to this side. So as I listen to what you're talking about around the forms and the structures, you mentioned, that the nature of who our students are is changing. I'm going to try to bring this full circle a little bit. You talk about, I want to talk about that even the person, the future that present and future students even desire to be might be different. The one they are desiring to become than who we've often thought is the end product of theological education, right? And so sitting with what it might mean to sit in the unknowing about what those futures that would be coming, even for our students who graduate and move on, might be. And what, this is not necessarily even a question directly for you, but thinking out loud, what would it mean to have those ends as part of our goals and to align the forms and structures that we've got this way? So one of the things that I think is difficult to think about is the reward structures for faculty, right? As one of those. We've got all kinds of others that show up, but what is good formation for theological education for seminary students? It's really hard to be the kind of professor who wants to do that work and remain in the institution because the structures aren't created to necessarily promote that, right? Or make that more possible than not. And so I just want to invite us to continue to think, what would it mean to have new forms and structures?
And can I just, this last look at the Pentecostal that keeps talking? This last thing is, I've been doing a lot of reading on what a number of higher education specialists are referring to as the demographic cliff in higher education. I'm familiar with this, where the 2008 we had the crash, and subsequently after that, pretty much our population, people decided to defer having children, right? Or to have less children, right? And so with that being said, now what we're seeing coming, actually it's already started, but what we're seeing is that just in raw numbers, literally, there is a major decrease in the number of students that are actually coming. That's just college bound coming. That's why you have all of these different kinds of recruitment efforts, even among like Ivy Leagues. It's really interesting to see how this is playing out with like free tuition. We've all been reading this, right? They're offering now free tuition. They're doing this, doing that. Because the numbers actually, there's been a precipitous decline. And this is having, it's already started, but will have a huge impact on theological education, right? In terms of, and many of these students that are accruing debt, they will not come in addition, the less number. And so with that being said, then the question is, what many of these experts are saying is that the average student is going to be, even just like 5 years from now, is going to be the working professional, the mid-career professional. And so, I mean, to your point about like what you were saying of like the work and reward structure, you can't do that based on the what the academic structure rewards. And it's just interesting to me that based on what is happening, I mean, part of what I'll be interested to see is the ways in which academia in some ways will be forced to wrestle with and to reckon with this demographic cliff and what is transpiring, and why there has to be less of a rigidity among faculty members on the various ways, the how question, in which we are able to facilitate the aims and ends of theological education.
Wow. Thank you so much. I wonder, do we have folks coming up ready for questions? Do we have questions from the audience? We do have one.
That courageous
Lovely.
first.
Yes. Oh, yeah, right there.
Come on up.
I went too far. Okay, I'm sorry. So this is actually from Zoom. This is from David Blair, who's actually an alumni in New Hampshire. Said, Barbara Holmes has just written movingly in Richard Rohr's column of Everyday Mysticism, a way of knowing that she grew up with in her family and community. Can you speak to the similarity or difference between everyday mysticism and testimony?
Wow.
Oh, my Lord.
Now, I haven't, I'm so sad to say, because I just love Dr. Holmes' work. I have not yet read that article, I think, that was just published. So you know, I of course, I couldn't reference what she's referring to by everyday mysticism with respect to testimony. But what I do know about, I'm thinking here of like, not that I'm a scholar in Howard Thurman, but what I've appreciated, we have some scholars in Howard Thurman.
We do.
But what I've appreciated about Howard Thurman and the conversation of like the inward journey, you know, like some of the what I would think are some, you know, like some of the mystical aspects, right, of what attends to the inward journey. I mean, for me, a part of like testimony as an epistemology, this goes back to what I was talking about the apophatic dimension, right? The limits of not just speech, but the limits of what we know. Normally it's through speech, but the limits of what we can know about something, in this case, God and the world. It sort of tutors us to be have a kind of epistemic humility with respect to what we speak. Is what I appreciate about Howard Thurman and the inward journey, and this is just me, like as I, you know, for about a year, I would wake up and I would read excerpts of Howard Thurman, like meditative, to sort of get me on track. And what I loved about Howard Thurman, and this relates to, again, to how I describe testimony, is that in some ways, mysticism, it is a kind, it is another form, another epistemological form, because it privileges those kind of non-discursive sensibilities that we often, like affectivities, right, that we often push to the side because we think that they have nothing to say about how we come to know something about the world or, you know, about God. And so for me, like testimony, you know, one is speaking technically, but to me, testimony service is not really in the speech. It's like in what we're doing. It's like the shouting, you know, the crying out to God, the raising of the hands, the music, which is epic, which facilitates an experience of God, right? It's all these non-discursive things that are happening that sort of provide the portal or an entrance, right, into what then these communities say about God and about themselves. And so, yes, when I think of everyday, like mysticism, I don't know if Howard Thurman would be necessarily categorized in that way, honestly, but I know in my own personal spiritual practice of reading Thurman, I meet Thurman as well in these moments of kind of mystical encounter in my own life, of really taking seriously, right, the sort of non-discursive ways, and that it's the form of knowledge, right, hence epistemology, that sort of corrects the arrogance, the hubris of our discursive ways, that we think language is what clarifies everything in all things. It helps offer us that corrective, but then most importantly, it just helps us be fully human.
Hi, thanks for being here, Dr. Day. Really appreciate it. And this is a little bit half-baked, so bear with me. But going back to the futures of theological education as it relates to the university, the School of Theology, the seminary, wherever it be. Is there a way in which, and touching a little bit on what Dr. McCarty said previously, is there a way in which the formative power of things like endowments and grants that enable the farm to exist are self-perpetuating of the commodification of like education that can't sort of be overcome other than extricating from the funds that support it? Or is there a, yeah, I don't know. That's, again, half-baked. But
Yeah, yeah. No, it's actually, no, I get what it, so if I can just repeat your question to make sure I've heard it right, it's, it's sort of like we have these visions of theological education, but they're entangled, right? I mean, it's a question of entanglement with endowments, with just the corporatization, right? That makes possible, that potentially can make possible what we kind of want to do, which is really important. But it's sort of this open question of extrication, like, can we extricate ourselves? And is it even desirable if it facilitates the very thing which, right, we want to do that helps us think about the flourishing life? And this is why, like, I bring Niebuhr up. I know Niebuhr so much, about about a kind of theological realism. I was going to say political and social, but really it's a theological realism for me, in the sense that I'm really informed just not by sort of a kind of real politic. That's the politics of it all, right? That you always have differentials and structures of power that are going to be working in their own interests, and so we work within that arrangement because it is what it is. But for me, it's deeper than that. It's theological realism. It's this idea that we live in a broken world. Right? I don't know how else to say it. A fragmented world, and a imperfect world for those that might be a little like, oh, broken. I don't know. Yeah, might be a little like you're getting nervous in your palms about that kind of theological. That we live in a fragmented world, right? We live in an agonistic world where you have competing interests and viewpoints for the goods we share in common. And so, the question becomes, well, what do we do? And what I'm interested in as a political theologian and a scholar of religion is not asking the kind of ideal question apart from the conditions in which we are grounded and situated in, and some conditions that are intractable. So, to your question, I don't have an answer, but for me, I say a sensibility I have, is that there is no way to have innocent hands, per se. And I don't mean like then one is guilty. If one is not innocent, I don't like that dichotomy, right? Because I think it gets in the way, again, of actually what is, and just the limits of who we are, because we're finite creatures of our own finitude and what we can do. So with that being said, for me, it's about being aware of the complicity that we share in. This is major for me, right? Like, yes, I am in a place of $1 billion. Like, Princeton Seminary is richer than like half of the countries around the world, like $1 billion endowment. And so there is a kind of complicity when I'm making a certain amount, and I know that people that keep the grounds are working in the service sector for the cafeteria at Mackay Dining Hall, that they're struggling and they're protesting, these sorts of matters, that there's a kind of awareness that we have to have, that although, no, there's a certain complicity we bear and we can't have innocent hands, it doesn't mean that we can't work towards proximate ways, right, of thinking about practices of justice, thinking about practices of care, and so forth. So it may not mean, right, that, it may not mean that what it means to, really advance the goals of the farminary and the aims, it may not mean that we can extricate that from the endowment, right? We would like, because again, it's most institutions that are $1 billion institutions, they're neoliberal, okay? Let's just be clear about that. They just are, and because of that, to me, the question is, how do we navigate that complex, ambiguous, and contradictory terrain in ways that affirm integrity? And as my grandmother would say at night in the end, really the question is, whenever you're talking about complicity and the need to think about what one does within that context, is then the question of integrity. What do I need to do to lay my head down at night and go to sleep and wake up and look at myself in the mirror, right? That question of integrity, so.
Thank you.
Other questions from the audience?
such a wonderful conversation, subject theological education, of which you're a part of. Yeah.
Hi, I'm going to jump in. Hi,
Hi.
Dr. Day. I'm Nicolette Minglass-Weber. I'm a sociologist of religion
Oh,
here,
nice.
also political sociologist, and I came at your work originally through your book on religious resistance to neoliberalism, which I loved, and that's kind of what I want to push on a little bit because we've talked about neoliberalism here and there, and us social scientists also love to talk and think about neoliberalism. But what I really want to focus on here is, again, because I love the concrete as well. I love bringing these ideas down to the concrete. So yes, any institution with $1 billion endowment is neoliberal. Totally agree with you. And I think we're already talking about this, but in terms of that language, what is counter neoliberalism? What is not neoliberal
Right,
in a
that's
world
true.
that is neoliberal?
That's true. Yep. Oh, that's the question. Okay, that's an affirmation. I affirm that. I affirm that. So I want to affirm the affirmation. No. Actually, it's an affirmation, but it does give rise to a question. I think you're right. And let me just say a word about what I mean. I don't want to assume that everyone knows what I mean when I say neoliberalism. Not only sort of like generally speaking, the kinds of economic and political arrangements that have come to be associated, with like free market global capitalism, as seen in the U.S., as exported around the world, exported around the world. Yes, I think we're all on the same page, generally speaking, on sort of the problem of late capitalism today, and its economic, the dismantling of the welfare state, policies of care. That tend to the social dimensions of those most vulnerable, say women and children. But then there's this other aspect that I talk about in my book of neoliberalism, and that is that it's a kind of normative rationality. There's a way in which it attempts to colonize all of the moral life, right? Which then, if that's the case, it then gives rise to an existential question about what it means to be human, fundamentally. And I take that to be a theological question, right? And so, going back to yours, I love the way you said affirmation of like, institution neoliberal, but what is not neoliberalism, right? When all of the economic, when much, I don't like to be totalizing here, but when much of the economic and moral life is just colonized, right? Then are we so overdetermined that we're trapped, right? This is a question of agency. And I would like to think that two things. I'm thinking here of like Emily Towns' work, Cultural Productions of Evil, right? Where she wants to speak of cultural productions of evil in order to like help us steer away from this sort of ontological perspective that doesn't allow us to see that in many ways evil has been built with human hands, right? That there. That's it. Yes, that's right. They're right, they're people's practices, but in some way, it's interesting to me about institutions, there's a kind of immanent quality, right, is what you get at. They're people, they're practices in that way. There's also a way in which institutions are kind of transcendent, right, in the sense that, we come to an institution not having any background or involvement, and it forms a sort of background horizon, right, and processes of socialization by which we now maybe are forced or, are willing to fit into. And so, in that case, there's something about the institution that absolutely, this is a good point actually, this sort of dialectic, right, between the institution as something absolutely governed by people, policies made with human hands, and at the same time is a kind of, and I'm being risky here, but a kind of like super human in the sense of it's bigger than any individual or collective group at one particular point in time. That's been that's done particular practices. And so with that being said, and this goes back to my book, and I'll stop. My part of what I hope as an impossible possibility is that on the one hand, there is a recognition, and I think this is important, that transformation doesn't need to be wholesale, or can it be episodic? And maybe fleeting, so to speak. But the episodic is not something that's a liability. It's something that shows our finitude, and that part of transformation is intergenerational, Right, precisely. And so even if we don't see the fullness of it, that we've done something that can live on, that others can take up as, so in that sense, then to Towns' work, then it is important to like really emphasize what you're saying. This idea and what Towns saying that it is made by human hands. So there is a dismantling that can happen, but at the same time, also, you know, just it's really just remembering that you know, institutions are machines, right? And it's sort of a kind of humbling sort of acknowledgement, but also it allows us to see that it's never one individual or one group or one generation's work, but it's also, as I just said, other generations that, you know, that allows us to see again that this institution is transcendent in that sense, which I like in some ways. It's important to say this statement because it keeps us going back again and again and asking questions about what are the conditions for the possibility of something being transformed. So I am hopeful. I do believe, but I think there's a realism at the same time. People are burning out. I'm watching this. Our social justice warriors and others, they're crashing. You know, and in part it's just like what we've been through. But the other part is, I think sometimes our theories of social transformation, maybe how we envision change happening, that we become a prisoner to our own theories about how that needs to happen.
Thanks so much, Dr. Day. I started thinking about this earlier when you were talking about the need for kind of the affective and epistemological changes. I'm a member of the Religious Society of Friends, another apathetic group of folks. Most folks call us Quakers. And I'm struck by the fact that kind of in our history, kind of the very first role a minister had was to ask the question, how is truth prospering with you?
Ooh, wow.
That's what we sent our ministers on the road asking itinerantly.
Ooh.
And we got yelled at for it.
Sure.
The big slur was, you're enthusiasts at the time. And I raised that point to turn the corner to a question because our response to it was to develop corporate practices. There was no way individuals could ever resist the system of the Church of England. We needed communal knowing, which is maybe one of the hardest things to overturn after the kind of Lockean Enlightenment, which maybe even precedes the neoliberal move.
That's
and
right.
so I know enough about you to think that you might have an answer to this question, which is, where have you seen practices of freedom emerging?
Wow. Yeah, but wow. I'm interested in ministers, and this has to do with Black Lives Matter. I was really, it wasn't just an interest or curiosity. I was really stunned in a good way at ministers. I knew fairly conservative ministers that many of them had participated, so they're older too, that participated in the previous civil rights movement. And I remember one said, it was in this congregation, the congregation was just like dumbfounded in that moment, but he said, I learned how to be Christian. This is in St. Louis. I learned how to be Christian through being in solidarity and marching with the Black Lives Matter movement. I learned how to be Christian, which is really, like it seems counterintuitive, right? That you learn how to be Christian within the communities, liturgical communities, the tradition of which you are a part of, you know, and then whatever you're doing out there by way of learning about, you know, your Christian identity and freedom. And the way, for me as a political theologian, the way I understand freedom, it is and again, you brought up this sort of Lockean, even Hobbesian, I mean, like the social contract theory, right, where freedom is a kind of, not only is a kind of negative right? It's a freedom sort of, I exercise freedom. There are certain freedoms we have in order to not harm, right? Not a positive one as such, positive liberty or freedom. But for me, it was in his statement, this acknowledgement, right, that for him, it just, in coming to understand what it means to be Christian, and to me this had to do with fundamentally how he understood freedom. It's not just in the sense of the kind of political freedoms that the Black Lives Matter movement was attempting to secure, but but this was a kind of like a freedom in Christ, right? Like, what does it mean, like in a theological register, right? A kind of power in Christ. What does it mean to rethink one's Christian identity as first for him? Because, I mean, as a side note here, and he said more, eventually he wrote about this, that he was homophobic, did not directly support women in ministry, all these different things. And then we know about the Black Lives Matter movement that in addition to those that were leading, that went across the gender spectrum, they also went across the religious spectrum, right? Some were not, were agnostic as such. And so for me, it's a really interesting way through this clergy person's, right, comment. To me, it's a really interesting way of thinking about, again, the formation question with respect to freedom, but again, freedom not simply being in the register of the political. And I want to be very careful here because my work is I'm a political theologian, for crying out loud. But not a crude political as in politics, right? But something much deeper. What I mean by freedom in a theological register is this sort of understanding of who the creature is made to be, right? What does it mean to be a creature, right? In the image of God, the Imago Dei, right? What does it mean? What does that mean? How does that give way to multiplicity and diversity and alterity? And how does that impact then in terms of identity, right? How I'm thinking about others, identity, like literally in terms of freedom, if you get what I'm saying. Then how does that then shape how I think about the political in terms of freedom? And so for me, the Black Lives Matter movement, it just wasn't that clergy person. I'm thinking of Starsky Wilson. I remember had a number, I won't try to speak his testimony, but I mean, talked at length about what he learned as a clergy person, a pastor, when he provided a safe context for those folks to come into his church while they were protesting for the time that they did. And so, yeah.
So we're getting close to the end of the time. So I see two questions over here. So what I'd like to do is invite both questions to be asked, and then allow Dr. Day to respond in ways that seem appropriate to both, and then we'll bring the time to a close.
Thank you, Dr. Day, for an informative session. Earlier on, you spoke about the center and this movement away from the center into the creation of sites. My question is, how do you see these sites not becoming centers in themselves, as they have different encounters away from the site, from the center? In other words, how do you see the sites not becoming the center as they move away from, how do you see the sites not becoming a different version of the center as they go through different encounters away from the center?
That's a great question. Oh my goodness, yeah. I'm sorry, do you want her to give the question? Okay, sorry.
Okay. This is kind of building off of my colleague's question. I have been taking copious notes in the back. What lessons can theological education offer other disciplines that are arriving to theological education as a vehicle to both decolonize self, but also to decolonize the ways in which we do the work of social justice?
So I'm sorry, I'll be very, because I know we're almost out of time. What a great question. I'm actually still thinking about this question, because there's a part of me that just feels it's just a kind of human proclivity to want to assert some kind of center, to some kind of centered normativity, some dominant normativity, right, around which we organize our life together, right? So I think, so that's just my sense of the human condition. And so with that being said, I think what's really important is two things. I think it's the way in which we are constantly engaging difference and power. And I think that these two are like really, really important because I think they go hand in hand. I think that part of the problem, at least in the community I grew up in, is that number one, certain forms of difference, they were a problem. And as a result, it then fostered and encouraged the abuse of power, right? The arbitrary exercise of power in states of domination. And so I think that a kind of awareness, a communal, if you talk about communal ways of knowing, they often are the hardest thing to overturn. And because of that, a community being committed and invested in a constant learning and unlearning, right? I mean, that's really, really courageous, because I just think as creatures of habit, we want to figure it out and find comfortability in the certainties that we hold. To me, I just think that that's just like fundamentally the way, human beings are wired. Or maybe I just feel that way because I live in the West. But I mean, but that's the way I think that we're often wired, at least in the modern period. And so, with that being said, I think that the awareness of as one on the margins of sites are engaging in community, to be aware of the ever proliferations of difference, right, and what that means for how one holds truth, right, for how one holds norms, for how one holds practices. We hold like this sometimes for dear life, right, and at least I'm learning personally how to hold certain things more loosely, right. And of course that relates to power. And the only other thing that I will say is, in addition to how we sort of control within community, not being remade in the image of the oppressive community that we've come out of. And this might sound really trite, but it's just the truth. Like, to continue to educate ourselves on communities that are actually saying to us, we do not feel welcomed, we feel excluded, and it's an education of presence. It's not just like an education of trying to comprehend, that's important, right? We want to listen and hear who they are, their identity, but I think sometimes we can get really caught up in the question of trying to comprehend, and so then our encounter isn't an encounter of comprehension, trying to figure out, right? Rather than just an encounter of presence. What does it mean? It's like when people are going through tragedy, they don't need you to tell them why the tragedy exists or how they should get over the tragedy. They just want presence, right? And for me, it's thinking critically, because I think that's, at least some of the communities that I've been a part of, this is what they lack. And this is the reason why they can't learn. They're not on this, continual process, in this continual process of learning, because they don't really see education as an education of presence, first and foremost, before they begin to form opinions and so forth. And I'm so sorry. The last question, I'm so sorry, maybe my age is showing, having to do with what we can teach other disciplines. I'll just say this, theological education, it's like in the university setting, the goal, the mantra, you read, certain, I'm thinking of like President Levin when he was president of Yale. I actually read his book on how he saw the humanities and the future of the humanities. And you see this sort of repeated among many university presidents, that essentially university is to explore and advance the boundaries, of knowledge, right? In some ways, it's about advancing humanistic inquiry and expanding what we can know. Well, I think theological education is saying something more than that, right? And I also think in other disciplines, there are some disciplines that also are saying that's not enough as well. I want to be clear about that. But I think that we do have a commitment to not just the descriptive, but the normative, right? That is something about knowledge that we are saying we should use it in service to, right? That I think it is a subtle distinction that I think can make a difference in the larger academy, but I think we need to be careful with how we do that. I mean, we don't want to reassert again like theology is like the queen of sciences or something like that, God forbid, no. But really, it is that normative vision, that horizon of something that can be, in light, really the flourishing life in light of the knowledge that we're advancing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Boston University School of Theology, please say thank you to Dr. Keri Day.
Thank you.
Come on, say thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Jenny.
So you have on your seats surveys and feedback forms about the event tonight. Please fill those out. Leave them on your seat. Someone will come around and pick them up. And before we depart right now, in addition to thanking Dr. Day, I want to thank Dean Pock for hosting here. I want to thank Andrew Kimball for doing so much of the logistic work. I want to thank the BU School of Theology faculty for helping to host this space. and to the online audience as well as our in-person audience for being here. Thank you all so much. And I want to thank the Lowell Institute for the generous support of our Lowell Lectures that happen once a semester. This year we have been focusing on the futures of theological education. You cannot wait for next year's Lowell Lectures. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure.